Sense of the proposed amendment. We're joined from our parliamentary studio by Constitutional Expert Phephelaphi Dube. A very good morning to you and thanks for making the time. It's not the first time that amendments are being made to the Constitution. So why has Section 25 of the Constitution caused so much controversy?
Good morning and thank you for having me. You're quite right in pointing out that it's not the first time that amendments to the Constitution have been made. In fact, there have been 17 such amendments that have been made to the Constitution since 1996. But the big difference here is the fact that there's never ever been an amendment to the Bill of Rights. There's never ever been a substantive amendment. All of the other amendments in the past have been amendments of a technical nature, which arguably didn't have such far-reaching implications as what we're currently seeing before us.
We talk about Section 25 so much, but just for the sake of our viewers, what does it entail and why do other sections regard it as an untouchable?
Well, Section 25, if one goes back into the history of how South Africa's Constitution was enacted, we need to bear in mind that our Constitution is ultimately the result of negotiations and that it, in essence, represents two positions of the most powerful set of negotiators in CODESA. So in broad terms, it represents the position of the National Party, and obviously the National Party was quite concerned about property rights of white South Africans, whereas on the other hand, the ANC was quite concerned about the fact that land needed to be returned to people from whom it had previously been dispossessed. So that being said, Section 25 does two things. It first of all ensures that if ever property rights are interfered with, that there's always just and equitable compensation. And then secondly, it tries to ensure more equitable access to natural resources, including land, and it establishes land reform through land restitution, land redistribution, as well as creation of tenure security.
So in your professional opinion, is there a need to change Section 25, or does the current legislation not sufficiently address the land issue?
Well, if one considers the fact that in terms of the Constitution, one doesn't need to pay for expropriation at market value. And in fact, the only consideration that needs to be taken into account is that of just an equitable compensation. So arguably, if it would be just and equitable in some instances to not pay compensation at all. So in that regard, it wouldn't be necessary to change the Constitution. But of course, people do want clarity. And one would say that there's an expropriation bill which has been sitting before Parliament for the past 2 years. And it's the role of the expropriation bill to give expression to the Constitution. So in that regard, Parliament really should be clarifying what exactly just and equitable compensation means, but using the expropriation bill and not the Constitution.
You were talking just now about recognition of market value. Some concerns have come out about security in terms of property rights. Why was it not given so much urgency since 1994, the amendment of the Act?
Well, in terms of the high-level panel report, which was released late last year, and it was really with the patronage of former President Kgalema Motlanthe, the report makes a number of interesting observations, and top of the list regarding those observations is the fact that there's just been a lack of political will to ensure that this kind of compensation, or to ensure that this kind of expropriation is carried out. And not just that, but it just appears as if there hasn't been much of political guidance in terms of how land reform is carried out. So, for example, the fact that we don't have a redistribution act, we don't have a way of determining who exactly gets access to the land and how exactly that access to the land is determined. So in a nutshell, it's really been the fault of the governing party that land reform hasn't been as successful as the Constitution says it could be.
You spoke also earlier about this being the first time that there's contemplation of changing the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights states that everyone has the right to equal protection of the law. Do you think expropriations without compensation would impact on this?
Well, absolutely. But of course, it depends on how exactly the final amendments to the expropriation, how the final amendments will look. In the sense that if the jurisdiction of the courts is ousted, then obviously that is going to be a cause for concern. But I think for me, the broader concern is looking at the track record of the governing party. And the questions we should be asking are, even if an amendment is effected, if we have a governing party that has proven itself to be incapable of carrying out land reform, what difference are these amendments going to make? And these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking.
What is your reaction to President Cyril Ramaphosa's statement that the ANC would propose to change the constitution even before the land hearings process has concluded?
Well, of course, on the one hand, it is important to have a president who is responsive, a president who shows that he's listening to what people out there are saying. And of course, if the general sentiment appears to be that the amendments should go ahead, it stands to reason that in a constitutional democracy, the president should be abiding by those sentiments. But of course, on the other hand, we also need to bear in mind the importance of public participation. And in a sense, the president's announcement served to short-circuit the public participation phase, because in a sense he made it quite clear that the amendment is going to be a foregone conclusion regardless of the public's input. So for me, that really was the real concern, the fact that the president's announcement appears to override whatever public sentiment may be existing out there.
You're watching The Agenda, and we're speaking to constitutional law expert Phephelaphi Dube, and we value your time, but we'd like a contribution, or rather interaction with our viewers at The Agenda_SABC. You can also send us your voice notes or your video pieces on 0817328421. That's your WhatsApp line. You can also call us on 011-714-6841. It forms part of our conversation today. The land hearings are folding up, and we want to know what your participation was or what you took away from that process. But Ms. Dube, as we continue with our conversation, there are those that oppose the amendment of Section 25 after the nationwide hearings took place. Do you foresee the process going to the Constitutional Court?
Well, I think for me the big concern again was the fact that the president appeared to short-circuit the public participation phase, and that on its own might open up the current hearings to a legal challenge, because the Constitutional Court has set very clear precedent about the importance of engaging the public, about the importance of ensuring that the members of the public have a say in matters which ultimately affect them. But of course, we also need to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture being that you need to have a constitution which is relevant and a constitution which speaks directly to the lives of people. So if ordinary South Africans want the constitution to be changed, then one has to abide by those particular sentiments. But of course, the due procedure, the due process must be followed in that regard.
How can we encourage South Africans to interact more with the Constitution and how it impacts them individually?
Well, I think that's a really pertinent question that you're asking, because the interesting observation, having listened to the public hearings, was the fact that a lot of South Africans seem to be unaware of the fact that the state doesn't need to pay for compensation at market value. And secondly, the fact that the Constitution already allows for very radical land reform. And in that regard, any failings of land reform have absolutely nothing to do with the Constitution, but are really the failings of the governing party to implement the Constitution. So it just shows the need for ordinary South Africans to be engaged, to become more involved with the constitutional process. And arguably, the fact that people came to these public hearings in their hundreds and in their thousands is a good indication of the fact that people are seeking to be involved in civic matters. But that's not where it ends. It's just important for people to be involved, to be engaged on a day-to-day basis, so that people can make informed choices about issues which ultimately affect their lives.
Ms. Phephelaphi Dube, thank you so much for your time. Ms. Dube is a constitutional expert, just helping us look at the folding of the public hearing process.